Howdy again everyone. The Viltrox lens company offers some of the best value autofocus lenses on the market today, and this new optic from them is, I think, the lowest budget they've ever put out. The AF 20mm f2.8, and at a price of only $160 this has to be the least expensive 20mm full frame lens around, almost $100 less than the also competitively priced Tamron 20mm f2.8. Potentially, this Viltrox thing could be a serious bargain. As I mentioned, it's an autofocus full frame lens, and it's coming out on Sony E, Nikon Z and Fuji X mounts, and I'd like to thank Viltrox very much for sending me a copy of this lens for evaluation, although as usual this is a totally independent review. I think 20mm on full frame is becoming the new 24mm, and that is a wonderful thing in my opinion. 20mm lenses are getting far more common now, and one or two manufacturers have even designed new zoom lenses starting at 20mm instead of 24, a trend which I'm sure will continue, and there are good reasons for this. The extra wideness of 20mm is helpful for video makers, especially if they have to deal with cropped footage or are shooting with digital stabilization. It's also easier to make lenses wider on mirrorless cameras than it was for digital SLRs, and also cameras are getting so high resolution nowadays that with a wider angle lens you can still crop into your image effectively for a tighter angle while still having the wider image to play with. And finally, I just love that 20mm focal length. It's an ultra wide angle, but without being so wide that it's difficult to compose your image. If you're shooting on an aps-c camera, then this thing will be the equivalent of about 30mm, much less interesting, but still useful. I'll be testing this thing out on full frame today, that's clearly what it's intended for. The lens's construction is dead simple, but it doesn't feel low quality. Although it weighs under 200 grams, it does feel solid enough in your hand. It's based on a metal lens mount with a USB-C port for firmware updates, but there's no weather sealing here. Then comes the lens's only control point, a plastic focus ring, which turns extremely smoothly. The lens's manual focus response was a little slow, but worked precisely enough. And here you can see that the lens suffers from a moderate amount of focus breathing. At this price point, that's what you expect to see, really. The lens's autofocus motor works accurately with an almost silent whirring sound. In single shot autofocus mode it's a little slow, but if you switch to autofocus continuous mode, it picks up the pace very nicely. The lens has a small 52mm filter thread. I found that you have to use very thin filters with it if you want to avoid problems with physical vignetting. Even my little Marumi Fit and Slim polarizing filter caused a touch of corner shading here. The lens comes with a small plastic hood, and while it does not feature image stabilization, it cooperated with my camera's in-body stabilization well. Overall, considering the lens's rock bottom price, the build quality here is absolutely fine. So let's take a look at image quality. I'll be testing it today on a Sony a7R III camera with its 42 megapixel full frame sensor. In-camera corrections are turned on. In the middle of the image at f2.8 we see great sharpness and contrast, although I'll tell you now, stop down to f4 and that sharpness becomes perfect. Let's stay at f2.8 though and look into the corners. Okay, the image is definitely a fair bit softer here, but still, for such a wide angle on a full frame camera, this picture quality is still quite usable. Stop down to f4 for a little more brightness and contrast in those corners, but stop down to f5.6 for sharpness to become very good there, and at f8 it looks excellent. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, where we see the effects of diffraction softening the image just a little. Still, for such a low budget lens, this is a good performance. It's quite sharp at f2.8 and very sharp from corner to corner at f5.6, and for $160 that's more than reasonable. Okay, let's turn off in-camera correction and take a look at distortion and vignetting, again on full frame. We are definitely seeing a bit of a weird, warping, moustache pattern of distortion here, although I've seen worse. Vignetting though at f2.8 is very heavy. At f4 and f5.6, that corner darkness is pushed into the edges, but still, it's pretty bad, and doesn't get any better if you stop down further. The lens can focus down to 19 centimeters, pretty close, although it lacks the half macro ability of the competing Tamron lens that I mentioned at the beginning. Anyway, the close-up image quality remains reasonably sharp at f2.8, but stop down to f4 and it becomes very sharp again. Let's see how the lens works against bright light. We see mild glaring around the light source here, a fairly unobtrusive purple flare, and a stronger white flare when bright lights are at the edge of the image, so using the lens's hood might be helpful here. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at coma levels. Bright points of light in the image corners see a little smearing at f2.8, but not as much as I'd been expecting, and at f4 it's gone. Let's zoom out then and look for sun stars. At f8 they really begin to emerge, and at f11 and f16 they're pretty strong. Nice. Finally, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. You have to get pretty close to your subject to see background separation with this lens, even on a full-frame camera. Those autofocus backgrounds look fairly smooth here, perhaps not the softest in the world, but I certainly didn't notice any particular issues. Overall, this new Viltrox lens may not be perfect, but for $160 it's certainly fantastic value for money. Stop down the aperture a bit for best results, and watch out for that vignetting, especially if you're using a filter. Other than that, I don't really have much hesitation recommending this lens to any wide-angle enthusiast who happens to be on a low budget. Thanks for watching everyone. Gah, I could test 20mm lenses all day. I love those things, and I also love and appreciate all my supporters over on Patreon. They make a big difference to me keeping this channel going, and I also like making all kinds of exclusive bonus content for them, including special videos and early access. Check it out in the description below, and ciao for now, everyone.